Today, we are privileged to have Ms. Dilrukshi Handuniti to deliver her lecture on media freedom in post-war Sri Lanka and its impact on the reconciliation process. Ms. Dilrukshi is a versatile global expert in mass communication with over 20 years of experience as a journalist, media trainer, and strategist. She served as a consultant editor of the Daily and Weekend Express newspapers. At present, she serves as the executive director of the Center for Investigative Reporting in Sri Lanka. She is the gender focal point of the International Federation of Journalists, Asia Pacific, and the co-convener of South Asian Women in Media, Sri Lanka chapter. She contributes to a range of reputed outlets including Jazeera, IRIN, Anadolu, Reuters Alternate, Mongabay.com, and SciDev.net. She was a Jefferson Fellow and a Democracy Fellow. A lawyer by training, she studied investigative journalism at Stabile Center at Columbia University, USA, and writership from School of Authentic Journalism, Mexico. She's a certified trainer by the International Federation of Journalists. She has trained journalists in many countries and has served as a resource person, visiting lecturer at premier education institutes. A recipient of several journalism awards, Dilrukshi won the Mervyn Silva Journalist of the Year 2012 presented by the Editors Guild of Sri Lanka. In 2014, she won the prestigious WASH Media Award presented by the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council and the Stockholm International Water Institute for reporting excellence under the Monitoring Committee category. Ma'am, it is an honor to have you with us today on this virtual platform. The session is all yours.
Thanks, Chandran, and it's way too extensive and elaborate a bio. Um, I guess that wasn't necessary. So welcome everyone, and I'm really sorry to be late. So we will keep flipping soon because we want to save time, and definitely we want to save time for conversations to be had. I'd rather speak with you than speak all by myself. So this is when the Easter attacks happened 2 years ago. So that's when this is the real life of a journalist. It's really not glossy. It's really, a lot of people think it's very glossy, and we do get glossy before camera, but it's a lot of hard work out there when you do field work. So I'm sure most of you remember what it was like. Probably I'm sure Indian media covered this incident in 2019 when there was a huge church attack, terrorist attack in various churches. So I just want to set this backdrop for our discussion today because my topic today is media freedom in post-war Sri Lanka and impacts on reconciliation process. So this is to highlight that all kinds of conflicts continue, and we continue to live with new conflicts and create new conflicts as we go along. So if we may go to the next slide, please. I would like to introduce the Center for Investigative Reporting very briefly, only because we have good interactions with the region. CIR was created by a group of journalists for journalists because there was a demand for the creation of this kind of institution. And our advisors include top journalists across South Asia. This includes two people from India, Anirudh Bahal, who used to one of the founders of Tehelka, and then Cobra Post, who edits Cobra Post, and then also Saidna Sakat of Data Leads India. So that's the other Center for Investigative Reporting in India. So I just wanted to introduce you to our advisors. If you, at some point of time, if you click on the link, that will show our advisors. Our focus is to work with journalists and with investigative journalists, and our reach is South Asian. We are a global investigative journalism network's only certified organization in Sri Lanka, and we work across South Asia, and in so many ways we present ourselves as GIJ in South Asia phase. So our mission is to work with students, media academics, and real journalists who are doing the hard work as investigative journalists. If we can move to the next, please. I'm not too sure about your understanding of the Sri Lankan conflict. So I just did a historical perspective quickly to show that we have Sri Lanka has had all kinds of conflicts for a very long time, and it's centuries centuries old. We have had invasions mostly from India and South India, and what we would used to call the Chola dynasty, the Pandya dynasty, all of them have had presence here, and there have been invasions. So Sri Lanka being a small Indian Ocean island, we have been always privy to this kind of influence from the other countries. Historians also have recorded that the Sinhala and the Tamil communities who have been in conflict for so long are the closest if we were to compare our DNA. And why I say all of these is because there is a great nexus between Sri Lanka's conflict that we need to discuss when we talk about how journalism portrays the conflict, and how Indian journalism also looks at the conflict. So there had been, so this is the historical evolution of Sri Lanka's conflict. One of the trigger points has been the 1956 Sinhala Only Act, which reduced the Tamil language to less than secondary place. And since then, there's been a demand for equality and a more pronounced call from the Tamil community in Sri Lanka for parity of status, recognition of the community, its identity, and the language rights. And all these tensions have resulted in multiple armed groups being created among the Tamil polity. And then in '93, there was a full-blown war in Sri Lanka. So that's the backdrop in a nutshell for what we're going to discuss, and why all this would also be of interest to you. In Sri Lanka, we are 22 million people, almost 22 million people, less than one of your big cities, mega cities, in terms of population. But the conflict has had a reach that's unimaginably huge, because we have huge diaspora communities living in Western countries and elsewhere in the Middle East, in so many places in Australia and Canada. So the diaspora communities also reflect these political tensions and divisions that we are talking about. And definitely this context also cannot be discussed in the absence of a discussion that involves India as well. So if we can move forward, please. So as I said, so 1983 was the big event when the war broke out. So if we were to have a discussion more about focused on what it was like after the conflict became a war, Sri Lanka has experienced nearly 27 years of war, and the conflict hasn't ended. The war has been brought to a close. So as I mentioned, it was about language, of equality, of about representation, of about identity. And there's been a political movement through which Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan parliament also outlawed any group that would want to cede and declare a separate state. This was in the 70s. And as Tamil nationalism grew, here is the interesting part, probably for a group of Indian students. This might be interesting to note that as Tamil nationalism grew in Sri Lanka, and it became a huge force, and the south of Sri Lanka began recording a corresponding anti-North political approach. And I think you have heard about and probably know about the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, and they became the most powerful and the dominant group. They identified themselves as the sole representative status, sole representatives of the Tamil speaking people, which has been disputed by other groups. But because of their ability to wage war with such ferocity, their strength, their capacity to reach, their capacity to mobilize, their capacity to find their presence everywhere else in the world and to mobilize funds, it became a huge force. And they also responded by eliminating other Tamil political leaders in the country. So in that claim to become the sole representative, this was done, and a lot of let's say democratic or mainstream political leaders representing Tamil nationalism they got wiped out along the way. So that's when I became a journalist. I was a child in '83, but then by the time we came into the newsrooms, this was the most dominant story. This was the only story. So all our years of youth was spent trying to cover this story. So next slide, please. Does it look familiar to anyone? It's like India, right? So this is from a place called Naguleswaram Temple in Kirimale in Sri Lanka's north. This is I just wanted to show how similar we are in so many ways. I was very fortunate to go and cover this festival after the war came to an end. Still, the residual impact of war was very, very present, but it was good to see what we generally have stopped seeing. I mean, I haven't seen this as a child because when we were growing up, the war was in full force, and people's religious cultural activities have suffered a lot, and there was nothing to see of this kind. Very, very little could be seen, small festivals. But after the war ended, people I guess resumed some of their cultural religious practices and were eager to go back to the life they knew before the war broke out. So this is a very historical temple, and I think it reminds you of Ganga and many of these bathing rituals that India has. So this is really one of the biggest religious festivals in north of Sri Lanka. If we can move on, please. So from Naguleswaram, I want to visually take you to through the place to show. If you look at this, the first photo, you can see people are lining up, people are trying to sell some stuff. And this is because they are able to celebrate the festival for the first time, the temple festival. There is an Amman temple. So the civilians who have been living in displacement camps, people who have not been resettled, were able to return home little by little. And it seems such a relief for people to be coming and doing these things. But if you look deeper, in the first picture, you can see there are pockmarks on the walls. There had been consistent artillery shellings. And this beautiful entrance, you can see the entrance to the temple on the right side. It's broken. Clearly, it's broken. It's been ravaged by the war, but people are walking through that. And it's also the first time in 24 years, or 26 years, that they were going to celebrate the festival. So it meant much. And as I said earlier, I was very fortunate to capture these images and the emotions of the people as a wartime reporter. If we can move forward, please. So because I'm speaking to you all, I just thought I'll put a little bit of context so that you understand the connection that India and Sri Lanka has, and how the conflict and the war connect us as well. We can never underestimate the relationship these two countries have politically and culturally, and in terms of religion. As I mentioned earlier, our DNA would be extremely similar, again, not just between the Sinhalese and the Tamils, the two main communities inhabiting Sri Lanka, but also between the Indians and the Sri Lankans. But India's role in the Sri Lankan conflict has always remained complex, difficult to analyze, and has always had a context and a placement in that particular time. It also has a very checkered history of feeding Tamil nationalism, and also has worked with the Sri Lankan state and played the role of arbitrator, the facilitator of discussions towards a solution. So, as I said, it's a very complex relationship, and many of the Tamil, there are many records, and these are historical facts, and I'm not saying anything. These are well recorded. So the militant groups have been trained in southern parts of India. So these are recorded in these two books and many other journals, many other research works. Assignment Colombo by Jane Dixit, who was the High Commissioner who served Colombo as the Indian High Commissioner during the years of when the war broke out, and also brokered a peace accord between the LTT and the Sri Lankan government, which was facilitated by India. And we also introduced, as part of it, a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, through which power was to be devolved to the periphery, allowing some sort of governance mechanism where you would have the opportunity for the majority community in that place to take decisions for that area. But everything changed. Some of those old roles have changed, and the political approach has changed after the assassination of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and the Indian stance towards LTT made a huge shift. And also, since then, and to date, India has worked with the Sri Lankan state to control militancy within the island, and also sent the Indian peacekeeping force to assist the Sri Lankan government and negotiated peace, brought the LTT to a discussion table, and continuously supported the Sri Lankan defense establishment to maintain domestic peace. So if we can move forward. So these are the two cover pages of the two books I mentioned. I just thought, just in case anyone feels curious, here are the two books that I have copies of each. The second one, of course, autographed by the author. So it might give you a glimpse about India and Sri Lanka and how we connect over our conflict. Next one, please. Because I'm talking to a group of students who are studying journalism and keen on journalism. From that historical backdrop, I want to fast forward this conversation to a discussion on narrative building. As we all know, and I'm sure you have your own narrative makers, and the state, of course, being one huge narrative maker. Every state does that, and they perpetuate it and maintain that. So that's natural. And this is part of the whole political approach of the nation state. The Sri Lankan government too naturally created a master narrative where the Sinhalese were influenced to become supporters of the war effort, the need to control the Tamil community, or let's say the LTT, and through that the political uprising and the call for demands from the Tamil community for recognition and for parity. And this also means culturally that you create a group of embedded reporters who are privileged and therefore able to have access to the places. I wasn't one of them. So obviously, because you don't want to be an embedded journalist, you want to be doing your independent reporting, and it's not the easiest thing to be doing when access is a privilege and access is only granted if you're falling in line within that government's dominant narrative. So likewise, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam also had a very dominant narrative of nationalism, of identity, of heroism, of suicide card as being heroic, and they were very good mobilizers. They could mobilize young people to join the forces, and they also had very good PR arms. They had very good outreach, and they also had their media outlets, from television to a very popular site called the Tamilnet, which was our go-to place to find out information. We knew there was an advocacy aspect to it, but the information was largely something that you could at least use and verify later. So they create, and when you look at the kind of network they created, and in terms of the information management and information distribution, the Sri Lankan state just could not even match what the LTT was able to do. So they had a very good global network of information movers and mobilized funds, and created platforms using the diaspora. A lot of Tamils from the north and the east have by that time fled the country, and not forgetting, some of them are still in South India, in Tamil Nadu, in Rameshwaram. So in this particular camp in Mandapam area. So some of Sri Lanka's refugees are still in South India, and they call it their home. And we have also created huge populations of refugees who have settled in other countries. So the war, one of war's biggest impacts on the people have been, besides the death destruction, and the overall impact of dividing and keeping people within a framework of a bloody conflict. It is also to drive people out of their own native place. Yeah, so if we can move to the next, please. So people like us have been always recording the island's conflict history for decades, and we will continue. And but go back to that first slide I showed you. Conflict is so new, and we create new conflicts and nurture new conflicts, and conflict also takes it evolves and takes new forms, and we have newer forms of conflict even today. So the thing about journalists is that they are the first responders. We always think in a bad situation, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a conflict, whether it's say COVID-19, and then you are able to sit in front of a television set and watch something because there's been a journalist who's been doing that story at risk to himself or herself. So journalists are also first responders. So we also are the drafters of the first drafts of history, and therefore there can always be a huge miss because we do not have the opportunity to assess and evaluate and do great research before you do your day-to-day reporting, whether it's visually done or text-based. So these first draft creators are first responders to any event, and they deal with data analysis and they build on their experiences. And as with all other conflict-ridden countries, Sri Lanka's narrative building too has been very problematic, very polarizing, and it has also reflected at a point the ethnic divisions we have experienced in our country of the Sinhalese and of the Tamils. This does not by any means indicate that all Sinhalese felt the same way, that all Tamils felt the same way. There is no one approach, but it was the dominant narratives. There were definitely in this country, there were two huge dominant narratives that were supported by the government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. And whether people had a choice, information choice is something that is worthy of exploring. Whether we had the choice of finding out other narratives within these master managed narratives is something that is really worthy of research. Instead, journalists ended up becoming conveyors of those narratives. While there are master narratives, there are dominant narratives that we also have contributed to perpetuating. So whether it is about our identity, whether about our language, whether it's about our political rights, whether it's about religion, and whether it's about culture, and the process of saying us versus them, and or the Sinhala supremacy over the other, and the Tamil narrative of saying that they are the vanquished, they were always ill-treated, and therefore they had just causes to had a just cause to demand for a separate state. It's been many years since the war, and it's been 12 years since the war came to an end. And we see, it seems that the industry has not learned enough. We have a lot of things to unlearn, a lot of things to forget, and a media reset is necessary in this country, where we still remain polarized along those ethnic lines, language lines, and political position taking that obviously plays out in our media. And when I say this, probably you can relate to what's happening in India. I'm quite comfortable, aware of what it is like to be an Indian journalist, and particularly right now. And the dynamics are not too different to what we experience in Sri Lanka. So I'm going to share some of these first drafts and those images from the conflict that probably has had an influence, and the fact that journalists are also carrying deep-set biases because of what we have lived through, and also carry scars. I do personally, and I'm sure others do, and our trauma, and the fact that whether we do enough to move away from these single narratives and to create accountable media content, at least in post-war Sri Lanka, is also something that's worthy of exploring. Let's move on. Okay, so some of these challenges may sound similar to the challenges that you see as well. In Sri Lanka, the challenges are obviously the polarized media and the fact that we have been embedded as journalists, and how to break these narratives, and the device, and particularly when these divisive content getting rewarded. We have schemes where the state would reward journalists for their coverage of the war, and that's only if you covered the war from a perspective of the victor, of the Sinhalese mindset, and that's the narrative that's got. So you throw a lot of resources their way to maintain that narrative and to make sure that the south of Sri Lanka's south falls in line with this narrative, while the north of Sri Lanka, whether they like it or not, would be compelled to fall in line with the narrative that is created by the LTT and other Tamil political movements. So for telling that alternative story, people also pay a huge price, and I'm not going to show you pictures of the price that we have paid in our newsroom. Our editor, who was a liberal Democrat, who always promoted, and that was our media policy at that time. I used to be a journalist at the Sunday Leader with the war. The war was full ablaze, and we were doing coverage of both ends, of the south and the north, and we definitely had an editorial position, and that is to support a negotiated settlement, and a role for India, and a role for the South Asian states to support Sri Lanka to end the conflict without bloodshed. So this was also not this was the most unpopular narrative, and for a Sinhala dominant newsroom to be promoting this was so unpopular, because the state by that time has lined up most of the media houses to fall in line with their thinking, not just the state media, also the private media. Everybody was tired of the LTT and 27 years of war, and there was a lot of heroism at that time. To say that we should go for negotiated peace was such a no-no in the eyes of people as well, and certainly in the eyes of the state, which was waging a war against the LTT, which is a ferocious militant group. And for the promotion of this, for highlighting how military could be corrupt and how human rights violations were taking place, my editor at that time, Lasatha Vikramatunga, who's also the UNESCO award winner for excellence in journalism, and also the Transparency International's award winner for integrity in journalism, was assassinated just 5 months before the war came to an end. And the narratives always come in many ways, and the narratives, if you look at the narrative building from a media perspective, we also have the victor and the vanquished always. There is a group that is victorious, and that would be the Sri Lankan military in this case, and then you also have the vanquished, and that would be the LTT. But along these, the victor also becomes the Sinhalese community, and the vanquished becomes the Tamil community. So this is the simmering conflict that doesn't get solved. And even after you defeat a military group, what you cannot defeat is how we feel about things and how we feel about our identities. And therefore, we have never explored the next step of negotiated peace in full. And I think that's part of what I'm supposed to be talking about today. So there was very little content that promoted, even after the war, that looked at our diversity, our pluralism, our shared cultures, our heritage, the fact that these two communities celebrate the same New Year on April 14th, 13th and 14th, and how journalism can demand accountability, and how journalism can be of public service. And when we set up the Center for Investigative Reporting, one of the core values that we swear by is to explore that new journalistic role that relies on truth, fairness, and accountability, and whether we could try and practice public service journalism that can help carve out a new path in journalism that can help at least the next generation to undertake coverage that is more inclusive, more supportive of peacemaking, peace building, and understanding of the other. If we can move on. As in, when you cover the conflict, it's really interesting that people come up with all the stereotypes, and I think this one image breaks certain types of stereotypes. Women are supposed to be, according to the stereotype, soft, gentle, and homemaking, and loving, and looking after their husbands, fathers, children, and cooking for everybody. And this is that whole stereotypical thing. But I've had the opportunity, I would say, and also the privilege of talking during peacetime, when there was a ceasefire, to talk to the women who were who belonged to the LTT's women's wing, which is now named the Malati wing, and Malati was, I think, was the first woman combatant, and she died of cancer recently. And so, if you were to explore the roles, they have also broken away from that stereotypical identity that there are expectations, societal expectations, that you would be this, a man would be this, a woman would be this. But the LTT also produced the human bomb, the suicide bomber, and that was always a woman. So when you associate those values of homemaking, caring, giving, which I'm sure women definitely subscribe to, there was also this unexplored area that women also can be very militant, and then the fact that the most ferocious of LTT cadres were the suicide bombers, and they were an elite group, and they were all, technically, most of them were women. One of my favorite slides, because I've been presenting on this for so long, and oftentimes when I speak to Indian audiences, I'm asked to talk about how, now as opposed to the Sri Lankan narrative, which is definitely polarizing and is of two tracks, of the Sinhala narrative and the Tamil narrative, or the LTT narrative or the Sinhala state narrative. India also has a narrative, and that's a very interesting evolving one. It's seen more evolution of its narrative than the Sri Lankan narratives. So very obviously, the things that I observe, and I have been studying this by scanning news reports, and I have done it for academic purposes, studying how the Indian media reports on the Sri Lankan media, as Sri Lankan reports on the Sri Lankan conflict and war. There are many narratives, and at least more than the Sri Lankan number of narratives. And one is the Delhi narrative. Delhi narrative has been the most evolving one. First, from being soft on the militancy towards taking a very nationalistic position and supportive of the Sri Lankan state in curbing and controlling extremism, violent extremism, and militancy in Sri Lanka. And the next one is what you find in South India, so, and not all of South India, but mostly in Tamil Nadu, very sympathetic to the LTT, very sympathetic to the Tamil cause, very sympathetic to the separate state. And we have had people setting themselves on fire, at a point soon after the war came to an end in Tamil Nadu. People were setting themselves aflame and trying to influence the Tamil Nadu Chief Minister Jayalalitha to intervene, make interventions, and to influence the Sri Lankan state to go easy on the Tamil population, and to make sure that their political interests were served. So that is, I wouldn't call it the South Indian narrative. I would call it more the Tamil Nadu narrative, and go elsewhere. And when I go to places like Assam and other areas where India experiences conflict, there is deep resentment for the Sri Lankan state. and definitely an overarching sensitivity and a softer approach towards separatism, let's say, of seeding, of identity, of indigenous rights, of of ethno-religious identities. I've seen that particularly when I used to visit Northeast India. I used to be a visiting lecturer, and I used to come to Guwahati a lot. And I would get to speak to a lot of journalists there. And it seemed that they have already had certain notions about what was right and what was wrong, and certainly did not feel comfortable with Delhi's approach. So I've also done research for the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis way back in 2014, looking at holistic and jingoistic coverage and how the Sri Lankan state actually promotes jingoism and how the Indian media supports the jingoistic approach for Sri Lanka to perpetuate. Let's move on, please. I'm going to stop in about 10 minutes. I just have more pictures than really text-based slides. So because we are also talking about conflict and whether it's difficult to speak about peace building in Sri Lanka in 5 minutes, but I would like to look at how media has supported peace building efforts, because whether they identified it was as part of the role of media, and whether public service journalism also meant that you would be a promoter of peace, or whether that would amount to advocacy and not independent journalism. So these are all good questions for all of you to think about. And nevertheless, this is how we covered more or less. If we were to look at key facts, we had, just as much as the state, we had highly polarized media content, and certainly we undermined issues generally, and kept people divided, and certain narratives also did not figure, and this was true of the Sinhala alternate narratives as well as the Tamil alternate narratives. We also didn't have exchanges, or the opportunities to go and work in a newsroom in the north, or for a northern journalist to come and work in the south, so that we can understand about sensibilities and what makes us tick. And by that time, because of the conflict, our language capacity has also been really reduced, because my parents, for example, know Tamil and are able to speak in Tamil, but I cannot. That's how the education system impacted us. And so you don't speak the second language in your country, and this also means you cannot really converse and even do your reportage. So you need always someone who has the capacity to speak that language to be able to help you with coverage. And this was true of any others as well, of the Tamil reporters as well. So there was always this inability to communicate. We were polarized not only by content but also by the divisions of the language. And on top of that, our audiences, we have, over the years of war, we have maintained our audiences in a particular way. They're not plural. We were talking, very hegemonistically. We were talking to our own identified ethnic audiences, and that's also how we covered the war. And promotion of pluralism, peace, wasn't part of the media's mission largely. And though some did that, that was at great risk and great peril. Those who did that was also mostly from mainstream, not mainstream, but alternate. But we were from the mainstream, and we paid a huge price when our editor was killed. So that's how we covered the war in a second. So if you will just give me a second. Okay, go ahead. Can we flip the, okay. So this is, I just wanted to share some pictures. It was very difficult to access some of these places during wartime, but I've had access. The first picture is more or less from the same place, but at different times. The first picture was taken when the war was at its peak, and it was difficult to have access to displaced people. These were all displaced people. So I was able to move around create access individually, independently, without being an embedded journalist. And then the second one is interesting because for those who know, the LTT was led by Velupille Prabhakaran, and he was killed in Nandekkada. There is a lagoon, and that's where his body was found. And there is overlooking an Amman temple, which is really supposed to be holy and extremely popular with the Hindus. So soon after the war, this is actually 2010, not 2011. So I was able to visit that place, and people have restored the temple and, paying homage. There were these offerings, the pujas. It was very sad. And I'm photographed facing that lagoon where, close to where his body was found. It was sad because I could only imagine the number of people who would have died there in that final battle, how many people would have been killed. And while it was nice and peaceful when I was there, and the water so blue and the place so green, and the temple all restored, and people being able to visit, it wasn't so just 1 year ago. If we can move, please. Okay. So these are from some of those reporting missions. The first one was from Ramanathapuram, where we way back into 2006, and the war was on. It was very difficult to have access. So I've gone with a group of journalists, and eventually did have access to refugees in Tamil Nadu, Sri Lankan refugees living in Tamil Nadu, and it was very revealing. And we do think people want to come home, and how people make that transition, and when they call it their home, and some other place becomes their home, and another generation has been born in India, and for them, South India was their home. It was quite learning, quite enlightening for me to go there and talk to them and understand the impact and the extent of the conflict and how it has impacted hundreds of thousands of people in Sri Lanka. And the second one is definitely from your city. It's from Bangalore. So I was actually making that presentation about how the narratives, the Indian narratives, media narratives were very different. This was for a group of women journalists in Bangalore in 2007. If we can move forward, please. Along the way, we have had the opportunity to do the political coverages of. I've met and interviewed many of the Indian political leaders, and I particularly like this photo, so that's why I put that one well over the others, because I remember the kind of security when two Sri Lankan journalists were seated to talk to the then Indian Prime Minister Indira Kumar Gujral, who's a very erudite scholar and who had lots to say about conflict and religion and culture, which was very different to the run-of-the-mill politician. He had very different ways of interpreting it. And so that's why that picture, and also to show the other picture is from Nagarjunakonda. As you can see, Sri Lanka is predominantly a Buddhist country. So this is the cultural connection these countries have. This is called the Simhala Mahavihara, where I've been photographed with a group of journalists. It's called the Simhala Mahavihara, Simhala meaning the Sinhala Mahavihara. So we have had religious exchanges. We have had Buddhist priests traveling to South India, and South Indian Buddhist priests coming to Sri Lanka and being resident monks and studying. So things we forget as we contribute only to the dominant narratives. These are the things we tend to forget, that there are greater cultural and religious bonds that we share as nations, and our divisive politics often color that thinking and prevent us from looking at the diversity of all of the story. So if you can move forward, please. I'm running swiftly to discuss an area that I've been asked to speak about. From discussing the historical context of our conflict to discussing uh, how journalists covered the conflict in Sri Lanka and how Indian journalists covered Sri Lanka or Indian media covered Sri Lanka. I just also want to add something just before I speak about the collaborative efforts. There was a time when all of India's mainstream newspapers had a correspondent in Sri Lanka. Those were the years when the war was raging and Indian journalists were competitively doing the Sri Lankan story. And when there was a war, in peacetime, we lose focus. In peacetime, we don't do that kind of story. So now we have people like me contributing to Mumbai Mirror and Deccan Herald and Bharat TV from Colombo. I've also been the INS correspondent for definitely for about 10 years. So writing to the Indian audience, uh, you know, visualizing a story for the Indian audience is something that I know and I've practiced for years. And however, Indian media's interest in the conflict has significantly reduced after the war came to a close, and there is not that much of interest in what goes missing in the media after the war came to an end, and when actually we should be looking at solutions. So that's also why at the center and generally in what I do, some long introduction to myself. My bio was read out right at the beginning. So part of my role as a journalist in Sri Lanka is also to work across South Asia. And these are the most, I would say, the most delightful assignments that I get. As we speak, right now I collaborate with Indian, Pakistani, and Nepali journalists, and starting with Bangladesh next week. So this is for us to understand that there is no single narrative, and the nationalistic narrative isn't, while it is there and there is no, we cannot dispute that it will always be there, but there could also be a regional approach to storytelling, that instead of judging the other, for me to come and judge India or judge Pakistan or judge Maldives, instead of that, to understand the many perspectives and the many narratives that are coming through on a particular issue, and then to be able to present it as a story that represents all of us as one, people from one region, is a media experiment that we are part of, and it's a very exciting thing. And I think for young journalists and young media scholars, this probably would be a way forward and something that you might want to consider. What we say is walk in the other's shoes, then you will at least get one more perspective. So let's move forward, please. So part of that work has brought me, so these are pictures from 2019. We did a South Asian collaboration, but there were a lot more from West Bengal and from Northeast in that first workshop, which was facilitated by the US Consulate in Kolkata. And then the other one, some of you may know the three people except me. They are very famous Indian journalists, all of them extremely well known and known for their reportage and great analysis of the very many Indian conflicts. So we are basically looking at conflict reporting, and this is way back in 2012 when I was still visiting the Guwahati University and working with students. Can we move forward, please? Okay, so taking this discussion about how do we create narratives that are representative and regional, and this will require us to have a South Asian sensibility. Very, very, very difficult. Very difficult, also because of the politics. We have India, we have Pakistan, and we have political positions that are untenable and very difficult to navigate. So this gets reflected whenever we talk about SAARC. We have had SAARC journalist movements and associations, South Asian Free Media Association that was also affiliated to had some connection to SAARC, and of which I am a member of. But still, these movements have flourished at a point when journalists have, along with the political leadership, focused a little more on alternative approaches and being softer. But when we talk about the nation states as we do now and take very majoritarian views, it's become extremely difficult to have this kind of engagement. So overcoming one such was that bringing journalists from India and Pakistan to a neutral place where they would discuss not, let's say, the elephant in the room, if I were to say the elephant in the room was Kashmir, but there are so many other things on which these two countries can talk about, and that would be your cultures, your heritage. There's so much that's so very common, and similarly Sri Lanka shares so much as well. So this was an attempt to have a cross-border dialogue with reporters, and then the reporters said we can't do the kind of journalism that we want to do, and let's talk to our bosses. So we had a cross-border gatekeepers dialogue to facilitate an understanding of doing stories that are more representative of our region and its diversity, and in fact our great cultures and our history that can still offer many solutions. Moving forward, on the right side you would see, for those of you who know, this is Said Nazakat, who is the founder of Data Leads, and also the person who leads the Center for Investigative Reporting in India. So Said is our advisor, regional advisor, and he's virtually training a group of Sri Lankan journalists on data journalism. If we can move on, please. So why do we have to collaborate? So in order to snap out of those old defeated storylines, we need a new approach, and we need to kind of break away from our jingoistic experiences and what has got embedded in us. And this is also, we are not soldiers, we are not counting dead bodies, we are storytellers. And how do we tell a story that benefits humanity and benefits our countries, and that's futuristic? And this can be done only if we also focus on our commonalities, not just what divides us. If we can go to the next one, please. So cross-border stories, we manage a cross-border platform because we actually ask people to cross the border, which is right within you, overcoming your inherent prejudices, and social cultural programming that has become such a part of us, and then to be able to look at the region's issues as well. While we definitely do, I'm not saying that we have to overcome and completely forget. There are narratives within our countries, and there are things that we continue to report on. We definitely do. How can we not engage our audience? But there are other audiences as well. And for younger folk in this internet age, there are stories to be told well beyond the territorial boundaries and our emotional and psychosocial boundaries that we create. Can you move forward, please? Forgive me for being distracted. I have to send a message because my other meeting is starting right now. So I'm just asking them to continue. So just give me half a second to send a message. I would say there are many reasons for collaborating, and we can beat that 24/7 cycle, the crazy cycle and the rating cycle that we all are part of, if we look at news and storytelling as a more wholesome endeavor that can be of benefit to the people. Right now, we are feeding dominant narratives and political interests as much as possible. The corporates are doing it, the industry is doing it, the journalists are doing it. It is a difficult vicious cycle, but some of us have decided that we want to break away from that vicious cycle. We have been part of that, and to do more evidence-based, fair and representative journalism, which this world needs, which this region needs, each of our countries would also need. Please move forward. So here are a couple of my last 2 slides, couple of examples from some of the stories that we have been doing. When there was a ban, Bollywood, no matter what, Bollywood is so powerful and so influential across the region and beyond. Bollywood's influence is tremendous. And for all the political divisions, Pakistanis do watch Bollywood. And then there was a ban on getting Indian films into the country, and we thought, oh well, so this is how your bilateral politics has an influence on culture and creative arts, and how people are denied access to the other through a creative form. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Oh, so here was the big story. This is about the big fallout when SARC became a victim of Indo-Pakistan politics. So we have been exploring different narratives. As you can see, we have definitely mobilized Indian writers and Pakistani writers to come and share their perspectives, because it's very difficult to bring them. And these are deep-rooted, these are really very deep political issues. And still, this is a simple attempt to show that you can do cross-border. You can actually go into the deep end of politics and also look at the culture and arts. That's also why the other example was shown, but that too is deeply, steeped in politics. So the next one, please. I think this is my last slide. So these are the things, some of the things we've been doing, that bringing, you will see many well-known Indian journalists here, seated right in front. He's Soumya Khandelwal, who's one of your top photographers, an iconic woman photographer who works now with the New York Times. And so these are the journeys they have made, and all of them have been resourceful and brought their own learning and their own experience to make South Asian storytelling a lot more inclusive, because we are not only ridden by our own conflicts in our countries, and also we are separated by the regional and very divisive politics of that we experience. So it becomes a huge effort. And I just wanted to end on this slide saying that there is always a good opportunity for good journalism. Thank you.
First question is by Vignesh. Okay. There has been no transparency majorly seen by mainstream media, especially conflicts about Tamil Elam. There is a widespread misconception about Vidhu Dhalai Puli and their protests in bringing peace to their people from the injustice done to them. As a journalist, how is it possible to tackle the rumors, or what are the ways to make people understand about false claims by mainstream media made on Tamil Elam? Okay,
I think the biggest vectors of disinformation, I think we go to a discussion now more current, and that's about misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. And our countries are very, very famous for this, right? So again, you go to the main narrative, those dominant narratives I've been talking about, and how these narratives are being perpetuated through the mainstream and alternate media as well. And as we do, whether it's about the LTT and whether these hoaxes are about the LTT or relating to any other group or individual or a political establishment, it becomes oops. Okay, I saw myself twice. It's very difficult to counter that unless you actually try using. I would think if I had to do that, I would use verification tools first to see whether there are real hoaxes. And the second thing is, always it's very difficult to battle against a propaganda machine. So you can only light that single lamp. Not a very conclusive answer, but I would say this would be the more realistic.
Ma'am, there's one more question. This is from Anonymous again. Since politics is involved all over the place, what advice would you give students taking investigative reporting?
Okay. Of course, there is, as they say, there is politics in the bread we eat, right? So in that case, there is no way we can divorce ourselves from the politics of our nation or the global politics. We are very much a part of it, whether you want to be a player or not. So understanding this reality, I think the issues that we face, you all face as young people who want to probably become journalists. Some of you. I think we need more investigative journalists, because there is so much, connecting to the previous question, there's so much of propaganda. There is so much of untruths. Media houses are behaving like propaganda machines. So how do we counter that? We need good journalists, and good journalists can only come if they come trained, if they come nuanced. And I would think that all our countries, your country and mine, we definitely need good investigative journalists and many more.
One more question, ma'am. What were the few problems that you faced while interviewing the people post-war?
Post-war? Okay. I mean, I can count more incidents than I have hair on my head, but it's that many. But I would give one example. I've come close to death in 2012 when you were very kind, Chandan. You read out my bio, and in that you said that I was Journalist of the Year. So to all those wannabe investigative journalists, I would say there is a price, and there could be a price. And if I got mentioned in that way today, this is also because of the work I did that year. And here is the story. The story involved the closure of the largest, it's supposed to be one of the largest IDP camps in the world. It's called Manik Farm. It was closed on the 30th of September 2012, and I was there covering that. And because of my language inability, with the fact that I don't speak Tamil, I had a photographer, a woman photographer who spoke Tamil and who was Tamil. So we were a great combo, very different language skills, very different skills, a combination. And when we went to do the story on the displaced people being resettled, the government has promised the UN that they would be resettled, but they were being relocated. So when you're relocated, you're not going back home, you're being sent somewhere else. So we discovered that 346 families were being relocated. This is, if you say 346 families, if you count the number of individual people, that's a lot more, over 1,000 people. So they were being taken to the thickets. I forgot to add a picture of that. And we went into these thick jungles, once controlled by the LTT and feared by most people. And we saw the military building those shacks to settle these people right in front of their homes. And at that time, both of us were told to go back home, immediately turn back and come back to Colombo. And but we did not want to do that. So what we did was we managed just one single photograph. There is in history, there is only one photograph taken by my colleague who was very brave to click one picture using two devices. One device was taken and the other she had. And this was when people were being not resettled, but we took that picture, but we were told that we would be killed along with the people. So, and to come back immediately. Immediately there was a death threat delivered by the military, and we did not know what to do, but we did not want to come back without the story. So we went back to the village, waited a little, spoke to the people. So actually that story, along with all the other stories, got me that award for reporting under difficult circumstances. Yeah.
Next question, ma'am. Can you please throw some light on UN and European Union interventions in peace building and resolving Sri Lankan conflict?
Oh, very interesting. So we have had brokered peace along the way, and all very temporary. And I think historically, because we have that very complex and very difficult relationship with India, which is true, and I need to recognize that. If not, India would have been the best state to play a role, given our proximity and our understanding. So we have always had this mistrust and the back and forth, and the history has our shared history, bilateral history, has been very problematic, and because of this, that role was never really complete. But so this allowed the space for so-called neutral parties, and the neutral parties were coming from Europe. So Norway coming into Sri Lanka to broker peace. And of course, we had a Norwegian facilitated peace process, and there was a truce. And that's when I was able to travel to these places for 2 years. We had no access, because only you can travel like that in peacetime. But they have always been very difficult, because the LTT has also taken very, very extreme positions. It's like, both sides wanting full pound of flesh just doesn't work. There is no genuine commitment. So I think the history of political negotiations, we have very sad negative stories, and we still have not achieved peace. All these negotiated attempts, personally, have a very different take. I think despite all the evolutionary relationship we have had with India, if that was the right thing to do, following the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, that process, if continued by the Sri Lankan state, and for that I follow the Sri Lankan state, we would have been on a far better wicket than having to deal with people who don't understand context and culture.
Okay. Were there any linguistic bias in the classroom of journalism during post-war Sri Lanka?
Yes. Long before, there's been a combined newsroom, and where Tamil, we just have two languages, so Tamil and Sinhala. They all work together. They both groups spoke both languages, and the northerners knew Sinhalese and the southerners knew Tamil, at least some rudimentary understanding. But this is one of the biggest things we lost because of the war, our inability to communicate with people, and the newsrooms were getting so polarized. Of course, we temporarily used people who were bilingual to push the stories, but there was no concerted effort to bring the perspective into the newsroom, that it was valuable, except in the English newsroom. In English newsrooms, the prized journalists were the ones who were bilingual and were able to have access to the North, because we understood we are telling an international story. But if you are doing that in just Tamil or in Sinhala, particularly in Sinhala, you are only talking to one community. So that thinking was always there.
Okay, next question is by Sarah. Looking at the dissension and freedom of journalists, how is Sri Lankan government treating the journalists?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? I lost you for a second.
Looking at dissension and freedom of journalists, how is Sri Lankan government treating the journalists?
Okay, the Sri Lankan government is not one single entity. They have evolved. Governments come and go. The state, I think the Sri Lankan governments have been they've had very different experiences, but during the years of war, they were in full force. So the government has been extremely negative to people who talked about peaceful solutions, like my editor who was killed, and our office has been vandalized many times. We've come under attack. We are a mainstream, more Sinhala majority newsroom, but we have had the experiences of the minority Tamils as a newsroom. So the state has really used brutal tactics to control media. There have been a lot of media suppression. Sri Lanka was one of the worst places for journalists to live and work in during the years of war. Only recently, after 2015, it changed, but there is impunity. We have never really brought those cases to a closure.
Okay. Ma'am, next question. You spoke about the Indian narratives when it comes to coverage of Sri Lanka. You contribute to different media organizations outside the country. Can you tell us about how different is reporting to local media and foreign media?
Excellent question. I think it's very futuristic. The question is, you would know this. To give you a bad example, Arnab Gosamis are everywhere, right? So all of us have them, and we need them. I guess we need them because they are perpetuated by us, right? Audiences, when we are the audience, and if they are there and the ratings go up, we maintain those narratives. Whether it's India or Sri Lanka, we all have these models. Um, it's kind of different because I think first one, a professional reason way would be that they would demand every greater attribution, double checking, sourcing, less opinion when you do reporting for foreign outlets. On the other hand, we cannot oversee. So that's the professional part, right? You have to attribute to sources. You have to have the right codes. You have to have non-judgmental language. For example, there are no terrorists when you write for international outlets. You have rebels. This is whether you take AFP, Reuters. This is language, internationally used language. So you have rebels instead of terrorists because terrorists has a value judgment. So, but those media houses also have narratives that they perpetuate, right? From Al Jazeera to The Guardian to anyone else. I would say Guardian is like one of the most delightfully independent media houses. But of course, when you contribute to foreign media, you definitely have narratives that they contribute to. A case in point, because this is a student session, is that you don't. I wanted to do a story about Myanmar and the fact that we do a lot of coverage on the Rohingyas, right? And then you also have there are other militant groups, but that story you cannot sell it to a Middle Eastern platform. So these are like the real realities of international media.
Okay, that's all questions for today. I have a question. How are investigative journalists paid? Are they paid really well? Do they make a lot of money?
Depends. I think in our part of the world, investigative journalism, like all journalism, broadly journalism, it's not a highly paid job, though it requires a lot of risk taking and sacrifice at an individual level. Our newsrooms do not our newsrooms really do not invest in investigative journalism and also in the investigative journalists. So there are two things, no? One is to build the craft, the other one is to build the individual. So mercifully, I'm thankful that I came from the kind of newsroom where there wasn't a lot of money, but there was a lot of opportunity and support to grow. But I would say good investigative journalists, good journalism does pay. And I would not cite any other example, but myself, I would say that I would definitely get my stories worth because I've been able to show that good journalism has a place and a space, and yeah, but I think regionally, as a region, all of us have to invest in the industry and the art.
Okay. All right. And there's one more question. How do we know if an anonymous tip is a factual source? How do you fact check that information?
Anonymous. Okay, so let's go back to what was the biggest data leak that we ever heard about? Panama Papers, right?
Yeah,
it's the biggest thing we ever heard of yes. And ever saw. So in that case, there was an anonymous source, right? First, so we go back to that anonymous source. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have worked with anonymous sources, and it's a huge risk. That's true. Whether it's a huge database at your disposal, or whether it's an individual giving you a huge opening to a story. So there was an anonymous source to the story that I gave an example out of for you. So there was always somebody. So for you, it's really important to verify a source. There are many things. Now, if it is online, you could actually try and use some of these verification tools, but it's about using a good network of people to see whether this information is true, whether this person is fake or real. And it's a huge journey. It's a one full day's lecture, actually, source verification.
So do you have some protocol that you follow before you go meet that person?
Oh, yes, anonymous was, oh my God, yes. You have to have. You need to alert your bosses, your supervisors first, in case you run risk. Never go alone. Never go alone. Keep somebody outside, and always be the one who determines where you meet that source if you've never known that person. If it's a real dicey, scary story, make sure that you meet in a public place, and certainly take your recording and use your devices. And now that you have the smartphones, use it smartly.
Yeah, yeah.
Chandan, ma'am is running out of the time. She has to join for the meeting also. Okay.
Okay.
We'll conclude. We'll
I
conclude.
think we are done over here because we don't have any more questions. Ma'am, that was a fantastic and a very information session, ma'am. Thank you so much. On behalf of everyone, on behalf of the department, we would like to thank Ms. Dilrukshi Anduniti for spending her precious time with all of us in this virtual platform. Her lecture uh, uh, on media freedom in post-war Sri Lanka has enriched our perspectives of how narratives can be manipulated before it reaches the intended audience. We were also able to recognize the presence of dominant government forces that influence the quality of journalism in Sri Lanka. It was also surprising to know how journalists adopt the narrative of the government for preserving their master narrative of culture and the prices they have to pay for not doing so. Her lecture has provided a platform to question the powerful forces that could influence the practice of journalism. Her knowledge, acquired from her decades of experience, has made the session truly wonderful. I'm sure all of you have found the session knowledgeable and interesting. Ms. Dilrukshi, thank you so much for sharing your precious time and knowledge with us.